This is In Step with Compliance, a podcast by the Modern Practice Solutions team for dental professionals.
My name is Olivia Wann, and this is In Step with Compliance, produced by Modern Practice Solutions. In today's episode, we are going to talk about two-factor authentication with our very own Brenda Thornburg. Brenda works day in and day out with clients on their HIPAA compliance and risk assessments. So we're going to kick this episode off getting started with, first of all, Brenda, what exactly is two-factor authentication?
Yeah, that's a great question, Olivia. Thank you. Two-factor authentication, it's a process of identifying and accessing management security. So basically what that means is that there are two steps involved for you to access a particular app or program or something like that. So let's take a look at some common forms of two-factor authentication. Push notifications are a popular form of two-factor authentication. Push two-factor authentication methods require no password, which is nice. This type of two-factor authentication sends a signal to your cell phone or that you can either approve or deny or accept or decline access to a particular website or app to verify your identification. So I'm sure that each one of us has had this even in our personal lives. This is a very common way for even like the banking industry and things like that to allow us access to our accounts. So Terri, do you have any particular apps or programs in your life that you're required to use two-factor authentication for?
Absolutely, Brenda. I have multiple items, like you had mentioned, the banking, and also I have it set up because for even my Facebook, I want to make sure that I'm the only one getting into my Facebook account. I also use it for my apps for my doctor's portal. The list just goes on and on. For email,
Yes.
There's multiple ones out there. Some I choose to use, and some I choose not to use, depending on the data.
And I think Terri just made a fantastic point. Because of her two-factor authentication, she's the only one that can get into and access those sites or those apps. That's the primary goal of two-factor authentication, is to keep people out who shouldn't be in there. Another type that's very common is SMS verification or text messaging. This can be used as a form of two-factor authentication when a message is sent to a trusted phone number or email. The user is prompted to either interact with the text or use a one-time code to verify their identity on the site. Voice-based authentication is another form of two-factor authentication. It works in a similar way as push notifications, except that your identity is confirmed through automation. This is not one we see as common, but a lot of businesses do use the voice-activated authentication as a means of protecting their data as well. So Caitlin, do you have some experiences with two-factor authentication? What advice can you give our listeners today on this process?
I think we should note that two-factor authentication is used in industries that require a high level of security, like you mentioned, the banking industry. So I would never log on to my investment accounts or my checking account without ensuring that that was enabled. You'll also notice typically for those notifications, if you're receiving a text notification, the bank will give a little disclaimer. Make sure you don't give this code over the phone to someone, because frequently there are scams involved where someone will set up that message and then request the number so they can have access. Since healthcare information is highly sensitive, it makes sense to enable two-factor authentication in this area and helps us comply with the access restriction requirements for HIPAA.
That's wonderful. So quite often I hear from clients, well, it just takes more time. It's an extra step. So let's talk about that for a minute, the cons and pros. Definitely multi-factor authentication is a reliable and effective system for blocking unauthorized access. It does, however, have some extra downsides, which include increased login time. users must go through the extra step in order to log into that application. That said, the risk of someone accessing your data and your information is far greater than those few moments that we take to follow our second factor authentication.
And Brenda, I'd like to interject a point, if I may, that
Absolutely.
HIPAA right now does not require multi-factor authentication, but it probably will, because the proposed rule changes for the security rule is to take any of the specifications that were addressable and make them required. So specifications were divided up into addressable and required. And unfortunately, anything that was listed as addressable, people thought that it was optional. And that's not the case, because where technology is right now, we can deploy these technical controls very easily. So like Terri mentioned, she uses it on her Facebook account, and Caitlin mentioned about the banking industry. So all of us are so familiar with multi-factor, two-factor authentication. Why would we not be using it for our practice management program? And Brenda could validate this, since she does the HIPAA risk assessments. When we do that risk assessment, the whole point is we're identifying vulnerabilities, and that could be one of them, is that we're not using multi-factor authentication. And it is a very appropriate security measure to use in managing compliance and protecting the database. And so access management is key, and having the right access controls in place to be HIPAA compliant. And I'd like to know, Brenda, when you're doing these risk assessments, what kind of take are you getting in general from those that you're asking questions? Do you feel like the majority are using multi-factor authentication, or is it the opposite?
I think more people are starting to use it. I think, a year or so ago, the attitude was, well, it's not for us. We're not at risk. But I think more people are starting to use it. And I am so glad that you brought up the risk assessment, because a couple of the questions on that risk assessment that I always get a little bit of kind of deer in the headlights look. Number one is the brute force question. And people don't know what that means. And so they just say, no, we don't protect against that. But two-factor authentication actually is a fantastic way to block the attacks of brute force and dictionary attacks, because the people who are trying to get into your system do not have that second factor to be able to access. So when we come to those types of questions, two-factor authentication is definitely a great option.
And I would think that for some of the practices, this really shows how important it is. Everyone must have an individual login.
Yes.
You can't share logins, because if they're sharing logins, for example, some will say, well, the dental assistants use this login for that x-ray database. If they're sharing logins, then it's impossible to deploy multi-factor authentication. And so that would need to be addressed, wouldn't it, Brenda, during a risk assessment?
Absolutely. And not only individual logins, but individual emails as well. Because depending on the type of two-factor authentication they're using, that code could be going to a cell phone number or an email as well. So each team member that's logging into the system really should have independent logins, exceptional passwords, and their own individualized emails as well.
Right, right. And Caitlin, what do you find when you're working on site or you're doing platform work? Do you get a lot of questions in this area?
I think a lot of people are familiar with the two-factor authentication from banking or those other areas we discussed. But like Brenda said, I think a lot of smaller healthcare practices feel that this does not apply to them. But it's important to remember that small practices, individually owned dental practices, can be really easy targets for hackers. And part of the reason is oftentimes they don't pay enough attention to cybersecurity in areas like multi-factor authentication, because they simply think they don't apply. I also notice on risk assessments that I do, sometimes practices will indicate that they use MFA where available. There are still some practice management systems that don't offer it. However, I think if our new 2025 security law updates pass, then certainly those will be implemented. But I think in some areas the industry lags behind.
And that's crazy, Caitlin, because I mean, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but if they are not offering multi-factor authentication, it sounds like a dinosaur. Because, like with our practice management program that we use internally, we have been on this program for 10 years. And it is a legal practice management program, but it has all of those capabilities built in. You know, the encrypted messaging, encryption to enter the portal, multi-factor authentication. But I think to supplement what you said, in some of the programs that do offer it, the office manager or practice owner or HIPAA officer needs to deploy it. There's a setting to switch on multi-factor authentication to ensure that your organization is using it. And as Brenda has pointed out, you know, some people don't like that extra time. You know, I keep my phone, I think all of us keep our phones close by. But when I'm authenticating with these programs and it's authenticating to my cell phone number, I'm glad because I know that it's me. Like Terri and Caitlin pointed out, even with personal programs. And it makes me wonder, like, for example, with Facebook, these people that end up hacked, you know, they don't hide their friend list. They're not using multi-factor authentication. And then they make themselves vulnerable to being attacked and potentially scammed. Now, there's other ways to authenticate. You can use a program like Microsoft uses a program. I find it just as easy to authenticate to my personal cell phone. Now, I have been on site where employees are like, well, I don't want to use my personal device to authenticate. Well, there's other ways to do that, but you have to have a practice issued email because if it authenticates to your email, maybe just a little bit more cumbersome to do it that way. Wouldn't you think, Brenda?
I do, because then you're going to need to get into your email, you know, find that email, get that code. I think quite often the fastest, most efficient way is actually to utilize your cell phone.
So, Brenda, let me ask you this. How would a dentist or office manager know that the staff is using the multi-factor authentication?
Well, first and foremost, they would need to have it set up for them and train them on it, of course. And that would be something that they could periodically scan for, even if it's with their IT company or something like that. They can scan to see what accesses, who's accessing, and how they're accessing their systems.
Okay, that's a good point. Caitlin, you assist me on HR compliance. What ideas do you have from an HR perspective if a dentist was going to roll out multi-factor authentication and make it an HR issue that it is mandatory? Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah, I think as with all new HR policies, it's important to document that your employees have read and understood the policy, and then also outline any disciplinary action that will be taken if they fail to follow the policy. Particularly with HIPAA, it's important to have disciplinary records should one of your employees cause a breach. We'd like to be able to show that they were aware of the hazard and signed the policy and understood that their actions would have consequences. So certainly a written policy is an excellent safeguard for the practice.
Yeah, so if they're launching this, maybe have a one-page memo that refers to not only their HR policies, but their HIPAA policies, and that, as you mentioned, there would be consequences if they are not following those procedures. Terri, what would you suggest on training? Would this be something that's lengthy, or can we accomplish it in a short training period?
I personally think if the team members are having a basic knowledge of authentication, it could be quick. You know, real simple team meeting, you sit down and you present the program, and this is how our practice is going to perform authentication from this day forward. Now, if you've got a team that's not real computer savvy or something, it might take a little longer training. But as a general rule, You log in, you're going to get a text message or you're going to get an email. You accept or you decline. And just like any training, it has to be specific for the office. What is the needs of the office? Because it's not a cookie cutter program. Some
So
people are going to need some more assistance.
okay, so what about roster? What would you suggest? I know that OSHA requires that we have the topic listed on the roster. Would you suggest that these topics be specifically listed so we have proof to show HIPAA?
I think the more documentation you have, the better. I think that it should be listed under your HIPAA training that you have, you've trained on multi-factor or, two-factor at least. And, because otherwise they can come, an employee can say, I wasn't trained on that. And you're like, you signed the topics roster, you signed the course attendance, you were there.
Right.
So,
And that's what I was looking for, Terri, because how many
yeah.
times have we heard that from a team member that nobody told them that, or, oh, the trainer that came last year didn't go over this. Well, it's built into our roster. So I think this is really important for accountability. We each have to take ownership in protecting the database. It's not just the HIPAA compliance officer or the office manager. It's everyone together as a team protecting the data. Brenda, do you have any concluding remarks about two-factor authentication?
I would just say, all said, it's just one more step that can prevent cyber criminals from hacking and accessing sensitive data. So it's a very important step. And I love the fact that Terri said this could be a fairly quick training session. It would be a great team lunch and learn, where the team just takes an hour out of their day and covers this one topic, gets it all documented and signed, and good to go.
And since you said that, Brenda, Caitlin and I are thinking, okay, from the HR perspective, if it's mandatory training, people have to be on the clock during that lunch session. Brenda will have the references in the show notes and also available on our blog, so that if you want additional information, that you can look up the information and present it to your staff. But we're very pleased to present this episode with In Step with Compliance on the importance of two-factor authentication. So thank you all.